Welcome to another Frontline recap. We'll be looking at major events in the week around Russia and the war in Ukraine and discussing some of the Times Radio experts' opinions and analysis that we've seen this week. I'm Philip Ingram, former senior British military intelligence officer, and NATO planner, and I do commentate on things geopolitics, defence, security, terrorism, and all the rest of it. So our first video this week is when President Macron went to visit Donald Trump in the White House. And if ever there was two egos coming together and power play from the handshakes through to the body language, through to the statements that they were making, this is a perfect example of power play from two global leaders who have got very strong personalities and are definitely egotistical in their view.
We're helping Ukraine like nobody's ever helped Ukraine before. And I can say this, if I didn't become president, Ukraine would right now still be at a level where there would be no even thinking about a peace. And it's a sad thing that this happened. This would have never happened, this war, if I were president. Zero chance. And I will say this also, it could lead to World War III if it's not solved. You know, there'll be a point at which it's not going to stop at those two countries. Already there's such involvement from other countries. And it could really lead to a very big war, World War III, and we're not going to let that happen either. And European troops may go into Ukraine as peacemakers. So when the agreement is done, they can watch that everything is followed properly. I don't think that's going to be a problem. And I will be meeting with President Zelensky. In fact, he may come in this week or next week to sign the agreement, and which would be nice. I'd love to meet him. Would meet at the Oval Office. So the agreement's being worked on now. They're very close to a final deal. It'll be a deal with rare earths and various other things. And he would like to come, and I understand it, here to sign it, and that would be great with me. I think they then have
Europe and America in NATO. Are you going to go to?
But yeah, at some point I'll be meeting with President Putin too. I mean, not soon, but I would be certainly, if this all gets settled out, which I think it will, sure, I would go there.
On the 9th of
and
May?
he'd come here too.
On the 9th of May on the Red Square?
I don't know the 9th of May, no. I think that's pretty soon. But no, at the appropriate time I would go to Moscow.
When do you see the war will end?
I think the war could end soon.
How soon?
Within weeks.
Weeks?
Yeah.
It's just frozen assets now. You can take the proceeds of the frozen assets, but you cannot take the assets themselves because it's not respecting international law, and we want to respect international law.
How is one different than the other? You can take the proceeds from it, how can you not take
Because it's very different. You keep the assets, you take the proceeds because they are paralyzed in a certain way, you take the proceeds during the wartime, but you keep the assets, and it's part of the negotiation at the end of the war. Because, I mean, this war costed all of us a lot of money. And this is the responsibility of Russia, because the aggressor is Russia.
Should the US
So,
be compensated?
so at the end of the day, this frozen asset should be part of the negotiation. All in all.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total efforts, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money. To be clear, we have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day, in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us, super. It will be loan at the end of the day, and Russia would have paid for that.
If you believe that, it's okay with me.
Donald Trump tried to make a series of statements about how America had been paying more than Europe in support for Ukraine. Francois Macron reached across very carefully and held his arm and corrected him on those numbers. Donald Trump actually seemed slightly flustered when that happened. The handshakes together and the way they were moving their hands, and you could almost see their knuckles going white as they grasped each other, as each tried to take control and suggest that they were the more powerful leader. A fascinating interview, but I think at the end of it, it shows that there's a degree of respect between the two leaders. And I certainly got the impression that Donald Trump and Francois Macron left almost equals. There was definitely the air of being able to do business and look at a common way forward. Trump did say that Putin would have to give some concessions. He talked through some of the deal that could be coming from Zelensky. He re-emphasized the importance of America getting something out of it. He re-emphasized the fact that Europe has been relying on America for too many years and Europe had to step up. We don't know what happened in conversations behind closed doors, but I think Macron will have explained how France is stepping up. And of course, it helps that he was one of the 2 European leaders who turned around and said that he would be willing to put French troops on the ground in Ukraine if there was any peace deal. Trump will like that approach. France has traditionally not paid a significant amount of its GDP to its defense budget. It's now over 2%. It used to be under 2%, but after Trump's last presidency, they've got themselves to over 2% just. And the other thing that Trump will be aware of is whenever the French spend money on defense, they spend it with French companies. They don't buy stuff in from the United States or elsewhere. So Trump will know that there are no business deals to be done, but watch the European tariffs that go into European manufacturing industries. And Trump has just imposed 25% tariffs on exports from the EU. So we'll see what happens with the UK. So our next video is a few days later, and this is Donald Trump with his first cabinet meeting. I did notice around the table that it was a very diverse-looking cabinet.
Well, I'm not going to make security guarantees beyond very much. We're going to have Europe do that because it's we're talking about Europe as the next door neighbor. But we're going to make sure everything goes well. And as you know, we'll be really partnering with Ukraine in terms of rare earth. We very much need rare earth. They have great rare earth. He's a very smart guy. He's a very cunning person. But I've dealt with some really bad people. But I will tell you, as far as this is concerned, you have to understand, he had no intention, in my opinion, of settling this war. I think he wanted the whole thing. When I got elected, we spoke, and I think we're going to have a deal. I can't guarantee that. A deal is a deal. Lots of crazy things happen in deals, right? But I think we're going to have a deal. If I didn't get elected, I believe he would have just continued to go through Ukraine, and over a period of time, a lot of people would have been killed, would have lasted for a period of time. And the reason that Ukraine, and I have great respect for the Ukraine as fighters, they have great fighters, but without our equipment, that war would have been over, like people said, in a very short period of time.
Is there?
Yeah, he will. He's going to have to. And I believe that because we got elected, that war will come to an end. And I also believe if we didn't get elected, if this administration didn't win the election by a lot, that war would go on for a long time, and he would want to take the whole thing. The big question I had is, does he want to take the whole thing? But the reason, and the Ukrainians are good fighters, I have to say, but without the equipment, without our equipment, we have the best equipment in the world. We have the best military equipment in the world. Without our equipment, that would have been over very quickly.
What concessions would you like to see? What concessions would you like to see?
Oh, I don't want to tell right now, but I can tell you that NATO you can forget about. I think that's probably the reason the whole thing started. Thank you very much. Pulitzer Prize.
I think the important thing that came out of this public-facing bit of his cabinet meeting was Donald Trump reiterating some of the conditions that he was expecting Vladimir Putin and Russia to come up with as part of any peace agreement. Of course, we've seen statements, or we've heard statements from Peskov, the Russian spokesman, from Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, saying that they are not going to agree to any of the points that Trump has come out with. I think this is Trump trying to force the deal and force a start point for Russia. Who's going to blink first? Who's going to give way first? Only time will tell. But what this tells me is we're a long, long way off any detail of a deal yet. and there's a lot of manoeuvring still to happen. So our next video is from Professor Scott Lucas, and it's fascinating. He talks about the difference in opinion and the difference in the looking at potential solutions from an EU and a US perspective, and the way from almost a cultural perspective of looking at different solutions there.
Well, here's the thing. If you walk away from Europe, right, you walk away. I mean, the starting point is, well, you ain't got no say in terms of what Europe does. Now, if you're telling me, and this is the bizarre scenario, that Europe then says, look, we're going to provide more assistance to you. And by the way, the EU, which remember is not a military organization, but has begun providing military aid. The story is they're working on a proposal for 20 billion euros in military aid. It doesn't cover all of what America provides, but 20 billion euros is pretty good, right? If they can get it into the right places to make the drones, to get the artillery shells moving, to provide possibly even air power. So, they're going to continue to work on it. Do the Trump people then say, oh, we're going to sanction you for helping Ukraine? I wouldn't rule it out. The guy, Trump, will threaten it, anybody at the drop of a hat with tariffs and with sanctions. But, the fact of the matter is, this just plays to my own long-term. I've actually said for more than 25 years, you can't just follow the U.S. This is not new for me. And I actually said it when Bill Clinton was president. So, it's not a Democrat or Republican thing. You're at a point now where you cannot just simply base your policy simply on how you think the Americans are going to react to it. That ship done sailed. And I think what you have to do is that you have to set a marker which is there alongside the U.S.-Russia talks. So, for example, the EU has got its 16th package of sanctions that are about to come into effect. Hungary's threatening to veto it because Viktor Orban is a pal of Putin. He's the leader of Hungary. But you just back the Hungarians down, as has happened in the past. You say, no, we're going ahead with the sanctions. And you just continue to do that. It means the EU has to move a lot faster than the EU is used to moving. And here I've had great debates on this. I think Ursula von der Leyen has been pretty good at the head of the EU. But I will give you the wild card here because I'm speaking to you as Germany is about to go into elections. And, you have to hope that you get a German coalition, which is going to be supportive of Ukraine. I will actually say I'm more optimistic than others because I think the party that's going to do best is not the hard right AfD, which everybody's going to be headlining. It's actually the Christian Democrats, who will be by far the largest party. They will be the senior partner in the coalition. And I think they'll continue to support Ukraine. In fact, I think they'll give more support to Ukraine than Schultz has.
And there are reports that Ukrainian intelligence is saying that Russia is preparing to actually declare victory in the Donbass. Is there a sign there that Putin is really looking at Trump and the US as his off-ramp from this conflict now?
He's not looking at off-ramp. He's looking to consolidate. The reason why they're going to declare victory is they're going to set a marker down, which is, we declared victory. And then Trump and his people are going to come in and say, well, this is the de facto situation. We've got to recognize it. So let's walk it back to what we're talking about in terms of basics. What Russia wanted was to make all of Ukraine effectively its puppet, right? They were going to put in a guy named Viktor Medvedchuk. He was going to be there at Kyiv. Now that plan fell apart when they had to withdraw from northern Ukraine in spring of 22. But in September of 22, Putin declares the annexation of those four regions: Luhansk, Donetsk in the east, Zaporizhia, Kherson in the south. But a few weeks later, Ukraine regained a lot of, some of that territory in the south and in the east. Since then, Russia's been trying to claw it back and get territory in the east, but they haven't got all of those four regions. What Putin would like as his optimal is for the U.S. to recognize, for the Trump administration to recognize those four regions as part of Russia, plus Crimea. That's what he would like. Now, I think what he will accept is that the Americans accept the Russian occupation, if not the annexation of it. That's the play that's in here, right? So how do you do that? You declare victory, and Trump gets boxed into saying, well, the Russians have already won, and then take it place. What it does is we kick it back to the rest of the world. It is imperative that whether it's European countries, Asian countries, countries in Africa, that no one else recognize that annexation of it. Because here's where I think you look at this in terms of where Ukraine could land. I've said this before Trump won in November, but I'll stick to it because I think this is actually where the Zelensky government is. And that is they're looking for something which is a rough parallel to West Germany, East Germany in the Cold War. That is, all right, the Russians occupy part of our country in the short term. We can't push them out. And Zelensky said we can't push them out. But they want the security guarantees where Putin doesn't grab more territory. And they want the security guarantees where Ukraine can begin to recover. Economic recovery, recovery of its military. Exactly the position that we were talking about in 1948, 1949 when Germany was divided. Now, the Germans had to endure 40 years of division. I don't know if Ukraine will have to endure 40 years of division, but I think if you could show a strong Ukraine with a functioning economy, a functioning government, a military that can defend the country from further Russian aggression, whereas you have an eastern Ukraine, which is badly damaged because, a lot of it has been leveled, where the people do not have freedom of expression, where the people do not have the social rights they have in Western Ukraine, then that's the line you play it at, and you keep comparing those two areas of Ukraine. I don't think Donald Trump will do that. I think there's no hope of it, but I think that's the counterpoint you put if the U.S. and Russia try to impose a settlement on you.
I think the solution is going to be dictated to an element by Donald Trump. It's then going to hit a solid wall of Russian intransigence and a slightly less solid wall of EU willingness to try and comply and a Ukrainian willingness to try and find a pathway to comply. So where it's going to go, we don't really know. But Scott came up with some interesting ideas. He turned around and said that what Putin will want to try and do is consolidate where he is and declare victory. And if he declares victory, then he will hope that Donald Trump will recognize that victory and take that as a fait accompli. This is where we are. And that would then, Putin would then see that as a way of stopping the conflict to get into a position where he could rearm, re-equip, take a breather and start to rebuild his capability again. And Putin, I think, would see this as a step, merely a pause before in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years' time, he goes back to take another chunk away again. Scott suggests that from a Ukrainian perspective, and this is part of what Zelensky's plan for peace is, Zelensky recognizes that he cannot take the territory back through military means alone, and has proposed a plan where the front lines are frozen, but then he will get the elements that are controlled by the Russians back by diplomatic means at some stage in the future. And Scott turns around and talks about this being the West Germany, East Germany model. It was over 40 years before West Germany and East Germany managed to get together again, and questioned whether there was going to be the political appetite for that. But it's an interesting model, one that I hadn't thought of beforehand, and that could be within Zelensky's thinking. Of course, during that time, that would secure Ukraine without any more damage coming in from Russia. It could build up its own military capability, its own defense manufacturing capability, its ability to defend itself, whereas to try and regenerate the areas that Russia has captured and rebuild what's in there would be very difficult indeed, because Russia has effectively destroyed all of the infrastructure, destroyed all of the towns and villages, and therefore it would take a huge investment in time and money. And Russia just doesn't have that at the moment. So again, Trump's views on that, where we're going to go, very important. So only time will tell. And our final video is from George Boris from the Institute for the Study of War. And I follow their daily outputs because they're very good and very, very balanced. And George goes into a lot of detail about the difficulties that the Russians have got. And I have to agree with everything that he's saying.
The burn rate in Ukraine, these gains that the Russians have made have been absolutely unsustainable. In raw numbers, from Avdiivka, which fell in February of 24, to the current Frontline in southern Pokrovsk, Russia's main effort, the Russians advanced a grand total of 55 kilometers over the course of about 14 months. They lost over 5 armored divisions worth of equipment, over 500 tanks, over 1,000 armored personnel carriers, tens of thousands of troops. This is not a worth it trade. If you just sort of look at the metrics, a division should be able to cover a frontage of this many kilometers and be reasonably expected to advance this far. That's not a good pace. It's actually quite glacial. And for the Russians to be able to seize all of Ukraine, I don't think that's necessarily what the Russians are going to do. But at the current tempo, it takes them 83 years, assuming they can maintain the current intensity, which is not the case given how we see them petering out around Pokrovsk. Russia's defense industrial base does not produce new tanks at scale with new serial production. They crank out there's one factory that does it, Uralvagonzavod, and it cranks out between maybe 30 tanks a month or up to 90 tanks a year. The estimates vary, but that's the range. Russian tanks that we see continuously getting destroyed on Ukraine's battlefields, those are Soviet-era tanks taken from Soviet-era long-term storage, which is a finite resource and which, according to the best open-source geospatial intelligence, indicates that they're going to run critically low on these infantry fighting vehicles and tanks in about a year, provided the tempo continues. Let's talk about how they actually get the men into those vehicles. Putin made a huge mistake in resourcing this war. In 2022, he should have used the monopoly of violence the Russian government has over its people to coerce hundreds of thousands or millions of Russians to go fight in Ukraine. But Putin didn't do that. Putin cares about his regime stability and his promises to the Russian people. Putin instead created a social contract with the Russians, which is, I will not coerce you to fight in Ukraine. I will bribe you I will pay you off to go fight in Ukraine. And so I will pay you money with these sign-on bonuses and financial incentives to voluntarily go so that when you're killed or wounded, you don't complain because that was part of the deal. That was a tremendous mistake because that could work for a short-term war, a 3-day military operation, even maybe a year or 2-year long war, but it's not work for a 3 or 4 or 5 year protracted war because it destroys the Russian economy. The liquidity portion of Russia's sovereign wealth fund has decreased precipitously since 2022. Before the war, the liquidity portion was about $96 billion, if I remember correctly. It's now down to closer to $46 billion, and economists here in Washington, some of them forecast that their liquid reserves will run out by the end of this year, all things kept the same. Putin can continue paying off people to go fight in Ukraine, but people are a limited resource too, and the number of humans that are actually either economically desperate enough to take that deal, or the people that realize that actually most people that take that deal end up getting killed relatively quickly, is growing. And so what we see now is that actually the recruiter is responsible for getting the 30 to 45,000 Russians per month that the Russians recruit. They're starting to complain to Moscow, and they're starting to say, hey, we're not able to meet the quotas anymore. Can we please lower these sort of things? I read the North Koreans joining the fight back in November, December as an indication that the Russians are looking for alternative sources to get boots on the ground. And so Putin will, at the current loss rates, he will have to call another round of mobilization like he did in fall 22. But that's not a get out of jail free card because the Russians are also trying to manage a labor deficit of 1 million workers right now. And so you can certainly mobilize more people, but that's going to come at the expense of you're going to have to pay them off. You're going to have to pay off their families when they're killed or wounded. And you're going to be robbing Peter and the domestic economy to pay Paul for taking people into fight in Ukraine. And so really, the approach should be, look, the longer we protract this war, the closer the Russians run to running out of steam with their Soviet-era vehicles, the closer they run out to their liquid currency reserves running critically low, the more acute their labor shortage problems become as the Russians continue to lose 30 to 45,000 casualties per month. And this will force Putin to have to make some very difficult decisions. I don't know how he's going to mitigate it. I'm sure he'll find ways to mitigate, but he will be forced to make decisions and make trade-offs. And really, look, trying to end the war and conclude it right now before these factors can really mature to a place where it puts the Russians into a binder would be a mistake. I mean, we can really extract a good deal the longer we keep the Ukrainians in the fight, and that also includes not just the United States keeping them in the fight, but the Europeans keeping them in the fight. I mean, we're at the point now where every day counts. It's the closer you drive the Russians to this hard place, and every day that the Russians get the deal sooner than they want, then they get to evade this potential bundle of problems.
Have, whether it's manpower or supplies or the economic problems facing the Russian economy, and sort of when will the crunch point come? And in your view, if the fighting continues further into 2025, certainly towards the end of 2025, that crunch point is very soon.
I can't tell you sort of like when's the second of Christ coming. I can't tell you the day nor the hour, but the current estimates that we have, best that we can do with our analysis is, I can't tell you the day or the hour, but this 12 to 18 month period, all the factors are aligning to this being a very difficult time. And I think it's why Putin's being very aggressive with trying to get a deal right now. I mean, because he wants to evade. He would prefer to not have to deal with it and fight it head on. He would prefer to sort of evade it with a ceasefire, because as soon as there's a ceasefire or an operational pause or an armistice, whatever you want to call it, the key thing is the tempo goes down and the Russians stop losing what they're losing. Then he can evade it.
He describes the tactical difficulties that the Russians have got on the front line in sustaining their operations. The fact that they're going through so many personnel, the casualty figures are enormous. The pressure that puts on their ability to recruit volunteers to come in, and I use volunteers in inverted commas, press-ganged individuals as well, but not going out and carrying out some form of mass mobilization that would have political implications on Putin. And he suggests that he's close to Putin having to do that. And also talks about the equipment that Russia's got and the equipment losses and the fact that Russia has used the majority of the equipment that it's got in its war stocks, and they've been refurbished and sent to the front line. And it's not going to be able to regenerate the volumes that it's losing out of its manufacturing base quickly enough to replace that. He then talks about the implication that has on the Russian economy, because as you get more people that have to be conscripted or volunteered to come into the military to be sent in the front line, it's taking those people away from the manufacturing industries, from business, from society across Russia. That's having an impact on Russia's ability to maintain its output from different industries to be able to support the population. And that's at a critical tipping point at the moment, he argues. So you're bringing all of this together. He very clearly articulates how Russia is close to a tipping point of its wider economy, its wider ability to continue to support the prosecution of this war. It could fall apart completely. He suggests a timeline of late 25, early 2026, or he suggests more 2026. I think this could be as early as late 2025. But it all depends on Ukraine's ability to try and accelerate that. And Ukraine, of course, is accelerating that through General Budanov and General Budanov's attacks on Russia, Russia's oil infrastructure, which is financing a lot of this, Russia's defense manufacturing capability, factories mysteriously catch fire, airfields, rail lines, logistic depots, command and control headquarters, and assassination of Russian generals, and an awful lot more. George talks a lot of sense. I strongly recommend you watch his video. So that's our recap of events this week. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to put comments below, and we'll look at those in our Q&A next week or the week after. And please sign up for Times Radio membership and you'll get more exclusive content. Thank you and goodbye.